Well, welcome everyone to our last session in our election series. We called this one Red State, Blue State. And the idea is particularly for those of us in a blue state like Connecticut, to get a sense of what's going on in redder parts of the country. And the two participants for today's, or two panelists, I should say, for today are Randy Adkins, who's at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. He is a professor of political scientist there. His most recent book is called Cases in Congressional Campaigns, Split Decision, which deals with the 2018 congressional elections, and Rutledge is the publisher. And he'll speak about Nebraska, and particularly this potentially very important congressional district that may decide the election. Then we have Pearson Cross. He's the department head of political science at the University of Louisiana, Lafayette, the Raging Cajuns. And he's got a book coming out, The Party is Over, Louisiana Politics in the 21st Century. That will be out soon with LSU Press. So I very appreciate both of you joining us, and I'll just step aside and let you run with it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I guess I get to go first. I'm Randy Adkins. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thanks to Kevin McMahon and Trinity for inviting me to do this. I really do appreciate that. I'm going to, if it's okay, I'm going to share my screen right now so that everybody can see a couple of maps that I wanted to just show folks. And I hope you can see those. So I'm from Nebraska. I'm not originally from Nebraska. I moved here 20 years ago in the fall of 2000 during the very famous Bush versus Gore election, when the election outcome was not decided until about a month after the election. And I've had some opportunities to leave, but I've decided to stay. I really do like Nebraska very much. And I particularly like living in the city of Omaha. Omaha is a great city to live in because I find that Omaha is very much like a microcosm of the United States in many ways. But I think if you want to understand a little bit about how a big city like Omaha can exist within what is a red state, I probably ought to start by talking about the state. So Nebraska is an agricultural state. The primary crops here are corn and soybeans. And also, Nebraska is obviously a cattle state. It's a beef state. Some of you before might have ordered Omaha steaks. So you're probably familiar with that product. Nebraska has 3 congressional districts. You can see here, though, that in terms of the number of counties that they represent or the number of acres they represent, those districts are not equal. They're equal in terms of population, of course. But the 3rd district is the one I'm going to start talking about. This is a district that is what we call here Greater Nebraska. It's out in the western part of the state. If you drive out there, it's extremely flat, and it is all farmland, or almost all farmland. And in some of these counties that you see, there may literally be 500 people who live in that entire county. In some cases, there are a couple cities out there, Hastings and Kearney, but in general, these are not very well populated counties. It is a very Republican district, and most people don't know anything about it other than at one time, Nebraska Cornhuskers football coach or former football coach Tom Osborne was the congressman from that district back in the early 2000s. So if you remember or have ever heard of the great Nebraska football teams from the 1990s, he was the coach, and when he retired from coaching football, he decided to go to Congress and serve there for a few years. Now, as we move east, you'll see the 1st district there in gray. The 1st district, if you look down at the bottom, there's Lancaster County, and Lancaster County includes Lincoln, Nebraska. And so that is where the University of Nebraska at Lincoln is located. So the Cornhuskers are down there. Aside from that, which is, a college town, and it is a very traditional Big Ten kind of college town, which is fairly liberal in the town itself. But aside from that, the rest of that district is like the 3rd district. So it will be very rural. It'll be agricultural based. And so what happens is you end up with a district that's probably got, generally, 2 Republican voters to every 1 Democratic voter. So sometimes people will ask if that 1st district is ever competitive at the congressional level or at the presidential level, because we do split our electoral college votes here in Nebraska. Generally it's not. So the district I want to talk about, you can see there, and I don't know what color that is. It's not pink, maybe it's mauve or salmon or something like that. That's the 2nd district. So the 2nd district is made up of parts of Douglas County and parts of Sarpy County. And after this redistricting that we are going to have after 2020, I imagine it will be made up of pretty much just Douglas County. I'm going to go ahead and break into another slide here that'll show you a little more closely what's going on in the district over time. So Douglas County, Omaha, the city of Omaha is in Douglas County. The lines inside of Omaha and Douglas County are not perfectly congruent, but they are almost perfectly congruent. So in Omaha, the city, we will have slightly more Democrats than Republicans. In Douglas County, we have about the same number of Democrats and Republicans. But when we add those suburban areas in Sarpy County, which is sort of greater metropolitan Omaha, we might call it, when we add those precincts in, we end up getting a congressional district that is slightly more Republican than Democratic. Now, one thing I should mention at this point about Nebraska itself, Nebraska has a label that is not truly independent. So it's not called independent, it's called nonpartisan. And about 25% of the 2nd congressional district considers itself nonpartisan. So there is a swing vote that exists here in any given election cycle. One other thing I will mention about Douglas County and Omaha, you can see here where the red parts of the county are versus the blue parts of the county. So you can get a sense of where the Democrats tend to live versus where the Republicans tend to live. So if you look, I think you can see my little cursor right here moving up and down. This division line here in our city is what we call 72nd Street. And so 72nd Street, anybody who lives east of 72nd Street is likely a Democrat. Anybody who lives west of 72nd Street is likely a Republican. There has been some creep. You can see right here that there's a couple of precincts that have been growing more Democratic over time. But generally speaking, Democrats tend to live east of 72nd Street. And you can see over here, when you look at the changes, you got a precinct right here. This is really sort of downtown Omaha, which is going through an urban revitalization. So there's lots of new construction down there, people moving into condos and things like that. And some of those people tend to be from the, I would say, the older crowd. Many of them are retired and they've decided to retire downtown, and a lot of those folks are actually Republicans. So there's been some Republicans moving downtown. But here, the point I want to make overall is that east of 72nd Street is pretty Democratic, west of 72nd Street is pretty Republican, which actually makes it really easy to do GOTV or get out the vote, because the campaigns tend to know where their voters are. Because of where their voters tend to live. I'll mention a couple of other things about Omaha, and before we talk about the presidential campaign. Aside from it being sort of a microcosm of the United States, some things that you will find that are different about Omaha. Omaha has, for a city its size, has an unusual number of Fortune 500 companies. So we have 4 Fortune 500 companies. The most obvious one to you guys is going to be Mutual of Omaha. The second most obvious is going to be Union Pacific Railroad. Also, if you've ever heard of a guy named Warren Buffett, one of the richest men in the world, Warren Buffett lives in Omaha, and so his company, Berkshire Hathaway, is located in Omaha. And the fourth one is a construction company called Peter Keywood Industries. So, so we have a pretty affluent town. A lot of what we do in this town is financial services. A couple other things that I'll mention. Omaha itself tends to be it tends to have more people who are college educated than other parts of the country. And then the other thing I would say about it is that it is a predominantly Catholic town. So probably 1 out of 2 people in Omaha might be Catholic. And that's obviously not common everywhere. So the last thing I'll mention is that for those of you who don't know by now, the state of Nebraska, just like Maine, allocates its presidential electors based on who wins the majority vote or the plurality vote in congressional districts. So that started in Nebraska in 1992, but Nebraska does tend to vote Republican at the presidential level. So there's only been one time that the 2nd congressional district has gone for a Democrat, and that was in 2008 when it went for Obama. And that was primarily because Obama spent a lot of time here, not he personally, but his campaign spent time and money organizing here in this district. That has also benefited Democrats very greatly running for offices in the city of Omaha and in Douglas County. So 2 of the last 4 mayors have been Democrats. Right now, the city council is 4-3 Democratic. So that gives you a sense that this district is a fairly competitive district. And in this election cycle, we've got a congressional race that is within the margin of error between the Democratic and Republican candidates. And at the presidential level, the last poll that I saw showed Joe Biden leading Donald Trump, but just outside the margin of error. So it looks like Biden might have a slight advantage here. Although I have to say that Trump was here last night, and I'm not going to say anything else about Trump's visit right now because it's been in the news. And so if you want to go take a look at how it's been in the news, feel free to go and do that. And I guess I'm going to stop sharing here and I'm going to turn it over to Pearson.
Well, thank you, Randy. That was very informative. And hi, y'all. I'm happy to be here. And I certainly thank Dr. McMahon for inviting me today to talk about Louisiana politics. It's something that I knew nothing about until I arrived here as a moderately freshly minted PhD, teaching down here, and then gradually got introduced to the state. So it's an interesting state in the sense that there's some things happening here that are very much like the rest of the country, but also there's some things that are slightly different. Louisiana, as you know, has a storied history. Some of our scoundrels, the Huey Longs and the Leander Perez's, have legendary status across America. However, you may not know that Louisiana, since about the 1960s, has been slightly out of step with the rest of the South. The South as a whole, on the basis of appeals from Goldwater and Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon, not necessarily in that order, started to move over to the Republican Party. So what had once been considered the solid South for Democrats has become more or less the solid South for Republicans, although that edifice appears to be crumbling a little bit if you follow Georgia and some other places. The reason why Louisiana was the odd person out in this particular connection was that Louisiana stayed fairly Democrat, more so than the other deep South states, for longer. So the 1964-65 Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, of course, the Brown versus Board of Education decision and all those things pushed, and the emphasis on law and order from the Republican Party pushed whites, particularly in Louisiana, into the across the South into the Republican Party. But that did not happen as much in Louisiana. It still happened, but not as much. In 1960, voter registration in the Democratic Party in Louisiana was in excess of 90%. So there really was no effective Republican Party to talk about at all. The legislature, the House and the Senate were entirely Democratic. There was no Republican at all. But as the rest of the South gradually moved from that status and became more and more Republican over the next 40, 50, 60 years, Louisiana resisted that urge. And the main reason why they resisted, there were two main reasons. One is that New Orleans is a city that has kind of unique status in the South in the United States. And that's always been a very liberal city, and a city where things seem to be a bit different. Had a large Union population and a large number of African Americans who, as soon as they got the vote, began voting for Democrats. The other factor, factor is that in French Acadiana, which is where I am in right now in Lafayette, Louisiana, had a large proportion of Catholics, and Catholics had had a long time attachment to and support for the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party had aligned with them on many issues. Now that lasted, frankly, through the 90s, and that's why you saw Louisiana going for Bill Clinton as Bill Clinton's election. So that affection between Democrats in the Acadiana region. However, the issue of abortion gained increasing salience, and the Republican Party and activists really used that issue. And gradually, Acadian Catholics have turned away from the Democratic Party on the issue of abortion and support for abortion rights, and have moved into the Republican Party today. Not 100%, but enough so that the state is now very much more like Alabama and Mississippi. So despite the fact that we have a much more complicated demographic profile than those states, with many more immigrant streams and more foreign languages and so on, we are in fact much like them politically, which means that if you were an African American, you almost certainly in this state are supporting the Democrats. If you are white, you are very likely supporting Republicans, particularly if it was estimated in the 2012 election that 14% of whites in Louisiana voted for Barack Obama. So there's a very strong alignment between the Democratic Party and African Americans and white people and the Republican Party. Independents can go back and forth. Now, what we've seen since is currently the figures are the Republican Party coming up from nowhere has now gradually made it up so that 32% of the people in the state are registered as Republicans. Democrats have seen their registration plummet, and it does it every year, so you can track it, down to just over 40% today. So that's down over a 60-year period from a 90% high. Independents are rising as well, so they are up at 26%. So the state is really at this point, you might say, well, wait a minute, 32% doesn't sound like, a really red state. But in fact, many of the people who are still registered as Democrats or independents are voting every time Republican. A couple of elections that were important in this process. David Vitter in 2004 was elected as the first Republican Louisiana senator since Reconstruction, followed by Bobby Jindal, who was elected in 2007 and took the state in a very right direction, helped by the committee to elect a Republican majority, which managed to turn both houses, the House and the Senate in Louisiana, Republican in 2010 and 11 respectively. And then Mary Landrieu was elected in 2008, and she is the last Democrat elected statewide for a national position. So she was defeated in 2014. So when you look at the delegation from Louisiana, we have 6 Congress people, down from 8 in 1990. We've been losing population. Of those, 5 are Republicans elected in fairly safe districts. One is an African-American, Cedric Richmond from New Orleans, who was elected in the New Orleans area and of course has a fairly safe seat there. Trump carried the state last time around 58-38 against Hillary Clinton, who is even more unpopular here than Barack Obama. Mitt Romney carried the state in 2012 and let's see, yeah, Mitt Romney, I think Obama got 40% of the vote in that state. So people really despised Hillary Clinton here. So what we see is a state that is really being hit from a bunch of shocks, you know, Katrina, the hurricanes, out migration, oil industry completely in the tank, and at the same time turning very, very strongly to the Republican Party. Now we do have a Democratic governor right now, which was an oddity that's been, much ink has been spilled over that. And I don't really have the time in this context to get into that. But in the last election, he was reelected governor, John Bel Edwards, of course, I'm talking about. He won, he's a very, very popular governor, but he's a Democrat. So he won by a 51-49 margin against a person who never left his living room, basically, and was completely unknown. So only by virtue of a complete, everyone got out the vote and they spent lots of money and ran against a complete unknown political novice, and they still almost got beat by a Republican. So this is a very, very Republican state, and I anticipate that Trump will carry this without any problem whatsoever. And I think that's it.
Well, thanks, guys. And just to those who are, that was very informative and very interesting in terms of what things look like compared to a place like Connecticut. So just to the participants, if you could start asking your questions with regard to, if you have any questions, please just put them in the Q&A. And what we'll do is we'll collect the questions and then I'll read them, and Randy and Pearson will answer your questions. So the Q&A is down there on the bottom, and you can type in your questions there. As people start asking questions, I just wanted to start, and I guess I have 2 questions for each of you. One is a general question, and then one is more specific to your state. The general question is, what do things look like when you go to the grocery store with regard to wearing face masks? As you know, we have a lot of spikes in various parts of the country, and this face mask issue is almost a partisan issue in many ways, in part because of President Trump. So that's for both of you. And then the more specific questions are, for Randy, as I'm sure you're well aware, and those who are listening or watching, if you haven't heard, one of the senators in Nebraska is Ben Sasse. And about a week ago, it was revealed or leaked or released where he went on basically a 9-10 minute rant about his opposition as a very conservative Nebraska senator criticizing Donald Trump. So I was just wondering to get your thoughts on that. And then for Pearson, if you could sort of elaborate on the role or the difficulty that a Democratic governor, John Bel Edwards, has in a very Republican state like Louisiana. So maybe Randy first.
Yeah, sure. So in the city of Omaha, we had a very contentious decision to enforce a mask mandate back in August. So the city council decided, I think, on a 5-2 vote. And essentially it was, if you remember the map that I showed you there a minute ago, it was the 5 city council members on the central or eastern side of town voting against the 2 city council members on the western, more suburban side of town. So essentially it was very much along almost party lines. So we do have a mask mandate in Omaha. What I will tell you about it is that many people like myself wear it like a mask. So I use it to cover my, nose down to my chin. Although I went into FedEx today to send something to someone, and everybody was wearing it as a football chin strap. So there were 5 people working at FedEx, and it essentially was, under their nose, covering their chin. I think 2 people maybe, it wasn't even covering their mouth. So so while people are wearing it, I think we're getting a lot of variation in how effective it is in some people wearing it. So that's what it looks like when you go to the grocery store. I don't really have problems going to the grocery store. My university, we are teaching some small classes in person. We are teaching a lot of classes remotely and synchronously. And then we have some online classes where they're asynchronous. So I think we've got all kinds of classes. And we do not have a big spike on our campus. So I think I can say that, although the numbers have been going up in Omaha. What I can say about Ben Sasse. So you are right. Ben Sasse decided last week to distance himself from the president. And it's funny because back during the primaries, he would not do that. He was asked whether he supported the president. And at that time, he said things like, I support the president's policies, or I support the president's Supreme Court choices. And he had some very specific things that he praised the president for, which actually he praised the president for some of those things in the phone call the other day. But at the same time, in that phone call, which was sort of a telephone town hall kind of phone call, where there were a lot of supporters, his supporters, who were on the phone with him because he is running for re-election right now. He decided to take a position that was not what I would say in support of the president. He did not come out with a full throttled endorsement of Joe Biden, but certainly he came out with a criticisms, a number of criticisms of the president. And you're right, he went on for a few minutes about it. So some people in Nebraska are speculating whether he is really trying to set himself up for running for president in 2024. He is a different kind of Republican. He's not a Tea Party Republican. He worked in the George W. Bush administration, and I think he comes probably more out of that vein. Interestingly, he is also an academic who studies the Constitution. He's a historian by trade. So he's a little bit different. He likes to give civics lessons when he talks in Congress.
Yeah, I think he spent some time in a little school a little south of Trinity, getting his degree. So
yeah,
he has a PhD in history, as I recall, right?
Yeah.
Pearson, what about you?
Well, when you go into a grocery store here, you do see people wearing masks by and large, and that's because the governor has instituted a statewide mask mandate. So if you're in a public place, like a grocery store or someplace else, oftentimes people are posted at the front to make sure that you're wearing a mask. Some stores don't do that, and some people are really upset about that and won't go in a store if they're asked to wear a mask. So that's kind of an issue here. Our congressman in the 3rd district has gained some international repute. His Congressman Clay Higgins, you may have heard of him. He's the person who personally posted on Facebook that if any of the Black Lives Marchers came down and were armed in Lafayette, that he would personally kill 10 of them. He said, I'll drop 10 of you where you stand. So he's very much, it's hard, he's someone who is very much on the side that masks are a violation of freedom. It's the heavy hand of the state. So he has a go at the governor, as most Republicans in Louisiana do, even while our state at this point is not spiking in terms of cases like many other states. But it's which many people say is the mask mandate, but there's still a great deal of public antipathy for it. And frankly, I think we will be spiking soon, if I have a guess about that. Moving on to the other question, which is how does John Bel Edwards, a Democrat, relate to Donald Trump, a Republican? The answer is very simply, he says nice things about President Trump. By and large, he avoids criticizing the president. He knows who his constituency is. He basically says anytime he can, he talks about how wonderful President Trump has been in providing us with, and let's face it, we need it, hurricane relief, FEMA emergency declarations, anything. And then he's very quickly to respond back to the face mask critics and say, I am following the Trump administration's guidelines on this issue, like opening up and doing this and that. So he's policing that line very carefully with an understanding that much of his constituency really likes Donald Trump. They also like him, but he doesn't want to get in the position of calling out Donald Trump.
Okay, thank you both. Now I'll go to these to the questions that our viewers have asked. Some are fairly specific, so you may not have them off the top of your head, but if you do, please share them. So first to Randy, and what's the racial demographic breakdown in Nebraska overall, and specifically in the 2nd District?
So if you look at Nebraska overall, Nebraska would not be considered to be a very diverse state. So but Omaha itself does tend to mirror society, or at least in the United States overall. I think the last time I saw numbers on this, it was about 10% of the population that was African American, and a little over 10% of the population was Latina. So when I said that Omaha is sort of a microcosm of society, it sort of is in that respect, aside from the partisan aspect that I was talking about.
Okay. And then in terms of Louisiana, is there a preference for Republicans in Louisiana driven by a single issue like abortion rights, or is it a balanced mix of issues?
No, there are lots of, it's not just one issue. I would say abortion is probably one of the most important ones. It also has to do with trade issues, with low taxes. Louisiana is a very anti-tax state. There are many issues. Louisiana is a very defense-oriented state, and a very state that considers itself very patriotic. There are lots and lots of flag displays here, and all kinds. The school kids are always doing something patriotic. So there's a real sense that the Republican Party is the party associated with the military, with anti-abortion, and then there's the guns issue. So Louisiana is the huntsman's paradise, supposedly, and those people all carry guns. And so the NRA is very, very strong here. So the Republican Party is seen as stronger on most of those issues. It also goes to say that, we don't really talk about it this way, but basically, if you are not that crazy about other races, the Republican Party is a spot for you down here as well. So there is a certain amount of racial animus down here, and that certainly drives Republican preference. Of course, I want to caution and say you can't really call Republicans racist and straight out in that sense, but it's unclear. It's clear that racial feeling contributes to that, but it's not clear exactly how much, and it varies widely. So I want to say that with a fairly nuanced way.
Okay.
And I think I could just add to that regarding Nebraska, if I could. Pearson's description of Nebraska on Nebraska overall, on abortion, taxes, what other, I forgot the other 2 or 3 issues you went through there, but guns. Nebraska looks very, very much the same. The place we're probably a little bit different is, we're obviously not in the South, and I think race probably is a little bit different in the South than it is in some of the northern states.
Right. Okay. By the way, one quick follow-up on that. There's a very competitive race, Senate race in Iowa, and last debate, and it's between Jody Ernst, who's the incumbent, and Teresa Greenfield, who's the Democratic challenger. And you mentioned that in your opening comments that soybeans and corn were the biggest crops. And Greenfield was asked the question, what's a bushel of a corn cost? And she got it almost to the penny. And Jody Ernst was asked a question about soybeans, and she was off a little. Now, can you just explain the significance of not getting that right?
Yeah, well, the question really wasn't exactly the price of a bushel. The question was, what's the break-even point on a bushel of corn for Greenfield, and then soybeans for Ernst. What I'll say about it is that if you're from an agricultural state and you're working on Capitol Hill somewhere, you probably should know the price of those two things, or whatever your major crop is in your state. And clearly Teresa Greenfield, she didn't calculate it to the penny, but she knew the price of a bushel of corn, and she could talk about what would be needed in the calculation to figure out what the break-even point was. So she wasn't really able to do the math in her head, so to speak, but she was able to talk about it. Joni Ernst just blew it. She missed the price of a bushel of soybeans by 50% or more, and then didn't understand how to calculate the break-even point. And that's important, I think, because she just blew the question and she had no way to respond to it. Now, we've all seen really good politicians who can talk their way through a tough question, and they can come out with some kind of answer, or they might just even talk about a completely different question. She just blew that question. And I think that probably hurt her with a lot of the farmers. Right.
Okay. Let's see. Back to Nebraska, this person's asking about whether Obama won in 2012 in District 2. I believe he did not, right? He only won in 2008.
Yeah, so the thing I'd point out is that Obama did not physically come to the district in 2008, but what he did is he opened a campaign office. He dedicated $1 million because he had so much money to spend in 2008. He dedicated $1 million. They helped the Democratic Party with get out the vote and voter registration. They did not duplicate that effort in 2012. And so there was really an absence of a presidential campaign here that year. The Clinton campaign did not do it in 2016, but this year, the Biden campaign is doing it. They're primarily doing it this year, though. Some of it's in the ground game, but not very much. Most of it's in TV advertising. I mean, I am watching probably 5 Biden ads to every Trump ad right now. And the other thing to keep in mind about our district is because we border Iowa, there's about 10 counties in Iowa that also are getting the same TV media market as Omaha. So when an ad runs over the airwaves in Omaha, it's running in Western Iowa as well. So so that's been very important. The president obviously is trying to make up for his disadvantage in money. You guys have probably read something about his disadvantage in terms of money, and that's why he's doing the rallies, because he's trying to generate free media coverage.
Yeah, so you mentioned that he was there last night. I think some people are still stuck in the parking lot from what I read.
I think I saw somebody on Facebook earlier today at about noon who said she was still thawing out. So it's really just to sort of share more than you probably need to know. We have an international airport here, Omaha Eppley International Airport. On the backside of the airport, between the airport runway and the river, there's a private terminal. And this private terminal is like where Warren Buffett has Bill Gates fly in when they have lunch together. So anyway, but they fly in, so Air Force One flew in Omaha last night, but then it pulled up to the private terminal. And that private terminal, think about how big an airport runway is. That private terminal is back by the river, and there's a little 2-lane road that connects it. So you have to first drive the width of the airport runway, then you have to drive the length of the airport runway to get there. And that's a pretty good hike. It's 2 to 3 miles from there to the airport parking lots. And so last night, people just started walking back because there were not enough buses to accommodate them, which meant the buses trying to get back couldn't get down the road. So the Trump campaign really, really blew logistics on that event last night.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Let's see. For rural areas of Nebraska and Louisiana, does Trump's fixation on tariffs resonate as a pretty large change from the historic position of the Republican Party? So why don't we start with Pearson first on that? And then,
You know, he's getting less, you know, you would think, and Democrats would love to exploit this, but they're not doing as well as you might think. It's clear that you know, Trump's tariffs cut against soybeans and cotton and some of the other crops that are the major producing crops in Louisiana. I think soybeans is the #1 crop in Louisiana, row crop. So you would think that this would be pushing people away from Trump and from the position of the Republican Party, but I think there are a few things going on. One, there aren't that many people who are involved. It's mostly super big producers, and so these giant agri farms, and they are getting what at this point is, I think, somewhere around 40 billion total in subsidies. And that's obviously not just in Louisiana, but across the United States. And so they're actually not doing as bad. So they're not, it's not great, but they want to stick with Trump for a number of other reasons. And he is trying to get them some cash to see him through. So it hasn't had much of an effect.
just one more thing before we go to Randy. You know, what's a comment like Biden's comment dealing with the oil industry do in the state of Louisiana?
Well, our Bill Cassidy is running, you know, to his first time getting a chance to run for re-election, jumped all over that and said, well, this should really let you know, if Biden gets in, that's an end to fracking, that's an end to oil exploration, that's an end to, you know, jobs. It's estimated that there are 65,000 direct oil jobs, oil and petroleum jobs in Louisiana. It's still a big issue here. Oil doesn't swing the big club the way it does, but they're pretty rich and they're pretty concentrated and they have a lot of power. And so that was really a huge gaffe in terms of Biden. But of course, he's not going to win Louisiana anyway. So I guess Biden would have to calculate against how many people are green. Is he going to pick up on the climate change, green energy side? Louisiana, he's not going to win anyway.
Yeah, and bigger issue probably in Pennsylvania and perhaps Texas, right?
Yeah. Now those states, it may make a difference. He may regret it.
Right. And Randy, about the rural areas of Nebraska?
Well, I would just say the same thing about tariffs that Pearson just said. And I think it's probably true in both Nebraska and Iowa. So I don't think there's a dime's worth of difference between a Nebraska farmer, an Iowa farmer, and a Louisiana farmer. So I think they're looking at these things very much the same way.
Thank you. Let's see, this one we sort of dealt with already in terms of race relations, Second Amendment, federalism, states' rights. For Pearson, concerning GOTV, meaning get out the vote efforts, do Democratic presidential candidates spend any time or money in Louisiana? And for Randy, has there been a noticeable difference in the ground game between Biden and Clinton from 4 years ago?
Well, to answer that question, no, Democratic presidential candidates don't. They may swing by to pick up checks. They may swing by New Orleans and grab some checks, but they're not really spending any time. They're not even, I don't think, really sending surrogates much. We saw that more during the Clinton era. When Clinton was running against Trump, then we did see some action. Clinton, I think, had some historic ties to New Orleans and so on, but we're certainly not really seeing anything from the Biden campaign. Now, we're getting, you know, President Obama weighed in and, you know, gave his approval to Adrian Perkins, the main Democratic candidate running for Senate. But an endorsement doesn't really cost very much to one of those people. So the answer is no.
And Randy?
Yeah, and I think what I would say is, I've already mentioned this a little bit. So that Obama was really great at helping with GOTV back in 2008, came into the district, spent $1 million on things of that nature, but then didn't do it in 2012. Clinton really didn't do it in 2016. Biden has some investment in the district, but with the pandemic, you're really not seeing people going door to door like you typically would. I'm hearing that the Republicans are actually going and knocking on doors, which surprises me. I wouldn't be surprised if they were doing drops, meaning they're just like leaving things at the doors. But I think the Democrats have been investing in telephone, so they're making a lot of phone calls, and I assume both campaigns are probably doing that, and they're probably doing. Everybody's probably doing that across the country.
Let's see, next question. Redistricting, obviously coming up after the census. Is it anticipated to dilute the influence of Democratic-leaning voters in Omaha? And then, or to concentrate them in a greater, in, I guess, the more Republican district, number one. And I guess I would also ask the same question to Pearson for Louisiana. I wonder if you might talk, maybe we'll start with Pearson. You know, we heard a lot about population loss after Katrina around New Orleans. Could you talk a little bit about how that has changed the state and its politics?
Well, it definitely, you know, there's been a lot of ink spilled on this, but it looked like it eliminated about 50,000 Democratic votes, which was significant, you know, in a state when statewide elections started to get towards a fairly narrow tipping point. In terms of redistricting, Bobby Jindal really held the line and didn't allow for a districting plan in 2011 that would allow Democrats to be competitive in more than one district. And in fact, since we lost this seat, he ended up putting Jeff Landry, who's now our Attorney General, but was a congressman, up against Charles Bustani. And so he had the two Republicans run. And that was all to keep the delegation at 5 Republicans, 1 Democrat. By the way, I have to say, Randy, I'm very impressed by the lack of gerrymandering that I see in your congressional districts. They look very regular, and I'm thinking, man, we'd never do that in Louisiana.
Our districts may look very regular, but in the last election cycle, I'm sorry, the last redistricting cycle, we took the city of Bellevue, which is in Sarpy County, out of the 2nd congressional district and put it in the 1st congressional district. And when we did that, we did it, the argument was that we wanted to have 2 members of Congress who could support Offutt Air Force Base, which is in Bellevue. So that's where Strategic Air Command is. You know, when they did that, the goal was to add 6,000 Republican voters, which was the outcome was to add 6,000 Republican voters in the 2nd district. So there was some gerrymandering that occurred. I have no idea what's going to happen after this election cycle. Traditionally, we've expected that there would be a compact district, and you know, it would just continue to get more compact and more compact and more compact until it eventually gets down to the city of Omaha. But I know that some people have actually talked about instead of drawing that compact district, splitting the district east to west. And if you remember what I said earlier, the Democrats in the district live on the east side of 72nd Street, and the west side of the Republicans live on the west side. So if you split that horizontally, you could put the Democrats on the east side of town into 2 different districts.
Right.
So I would not be surprised to see that at all. We do, by the way, have one of the few quote unquote nonpartisan legislatures in the country, but it's only nonpartisan in the sense of how they run for the primaries. It's not nonpartisan in the sense of how they govern.
And the country's only unicameral legislature.
The country's only unicameral. We only have 49 legislators.
You know, I was thinking, Randy, that reminds me very much of Austin, right? Where they've taken Austin and they've managed to, you know, make it much less liberal than it would be ordinarily in Texas politics by including Austin then becomes the spoke of the pie. And there are lots and lots of conservative areas swept into all those districts that append to it. So the same thing could happen with Omaha, I guess.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, that sort of leads to one of the questions that's on the list. I'm trying to get the various questions. Do progressive Democrats have a chance against Republicans in states like Louisiana or Nebraska? And I guess just to add on to that, do the Democrats that do get elected, do they tend to be more moderate Democrats at the congressional level, or can you have a progressive Democrat?
There,
Well,
go
go
ahead,
ahead.
Randy.
I was gonna say, specifically talking about the Carr Eastman, Don Bacon race and here in Omaha, there were two candidates in the Democratic primary that ran. Carr Eastman was the more progressive of the two candidates. The other candidate was a self-avowed centrist. Obviously, the progressive candidate ended up winning. And I think you get back to the issue of where sometimes in the primaries, you have to be more liberal or more conservative. But then once you get to the general election and once you get to governing, you may have to be more centrist in order to stay in office. If Carr Eastman goes to Congress, if she gets elected and goes to Congress and votes as a progressive, I think she will be there for 2 years and then she will be out.
And what's the race look like? Does she have a chance of winning?
So the last poll that came out, which was about 3 weeks ago, had her up 2. The poll that came out the week before that had her down 2.
Got it. And Pearson, any chance for progressives in a state like Louisiana?
Well, yeah, of course, there's a chance, assuming that you're in a majority minority district.
Right.
So the answer to that question is depending on how the district is crafted, yes. If it's not a majority district, then the chances of a progressive getting elected are very, very low. Unless you get up, they're zero. Let me change that. They're zero. Now, if you're a Democrat, you can get elected, as our governor did, by being a pro Second Amendment, pro God, anti-abortion, low taxes Democrat. So if you can make that work, and plus he was a graduate of West Point and regular military. So, if you can put all of those things together, then you can still get elected in Louisiana.
And he's had the benefit of some, as you mentioned, some bad candidates as opponents too, right?
Yeah, without David Vitter having this horrible moment of calling a prostitute from the floor of the House at a moment when they were debating whether or not to honor veterans of the Afghanistan war, and that was exploited quite well. And so it was certainly something nobody anticipated. I was very wrong. I was all over the state papers saying, "Oh, Vitter's going to win in a landslide." It's a little humbling.
Yes. Well, predicting elections is different after 2016, that's for sure, right?
Wow. Say that again.
Let's see. Can both Dr. Cross and Dr. Atkins discuss any contextual issues that might lead their populists toward shifting their party alliance in the forthcoming presidential election? Any issues that might, whether it's abortion rights, environmental issues, economic factors that would maybe not this election, but looking to the future.
Louisiana, and I'll start. Louisiana is a state that's very much in stasis. We're losing population. We're not getting much population from outside moving in. The people that are here are pretty much dug in. I don't foresee another issue that would cause people to change alliance. You would think, because if there was one, it would be climate change, right? I mean, our coast is basically melting away. Where I am in Lafayette, they say there's going to be oceanfront in 30 years. That's 25 miles in. Wow. You would think that if there were an issue, it would be climate change and green energy. But the oil industry has a lock on that. And as a result, I just don't see any changes now.
Yeah, I don't. Well, I will say the changes that I see in Nebraska are not changes that are based on issues. I would say that in Nebraska, we don't have 2 political parties, we have 4. We have 2 versions of the Republican Party and 2 versions of the Democratic Party. On the Democratic side, you have the older sort of Bill Clinton centrists, and then you have the newer Bernie Sanders progressives. The progressives are winning that battle. Not only are they winning it, but they're younger. And so what's happening over time is the centrists are they're either getting old, not participating in politics, or they're just passing on. On the Republican side, you've got sort of a Tea Party group that is in some ways led by, you may have heard of Pete Ricketts, that he's our governor, and his family owns the Chicago Cubs, but they also formerly owned TD Ameritrade. And so they are connected with the Tea Party movement. And so that is running very strong in Nebraska. And then there are still a lot of older, what I would call George Bush conservatives. And I don't mean George W. Bush, I mean George H.W. Bush conservatives. And again, they're just getting older and they're passing on. And what's happening is the center is beginning to disappear in Nebraska politics, which was a center that elected Democrats occasionally, like a Bob Kerrey or a Ben Nelson, who served as governor and then later in the Senate in those cases. So politics in Nebraska is starting to get much more polarized as well.
Since you brought him up, we only have a couple minutes left, so I'll just ask this one question for Randy, and then I'll ask one from the Q&A. What role does Warren Buffett play? I mean, given his, I think his dad was a Republican congressman, if I recall correctly, but he has supported Democratic candidates more recently, and certainly has criticized Republican tax policies. What role does he play given his presence, in Omaha?
He doesn't really play any role at all in national level politics. He doesn't comment on it. He doesn't say much about it. He doesn't participate in it. You can see who if you want to go to opensecrets.org, you can see who he gives to. He tends to give to Democrats. Berkshire Hathaway's PAC tends to give to Democrats. But the one place that he has been very vocal, the casino industry is trying to, they have 3 initiatives that they've gotten onto the ballot this time. State initiatives to amend the Constitution to allow gambling in the state of Nebraska. He is, along with Tom Osborne, very vocally opposed to that, and he's putting a lot of money into TV ads and other efforts to try to stop that. So, so his interests tend to be more parochial in terms of politics than they tend to be national.
Got it. Okay, thank you. And then last question, and this is addressed to Randy, but we'll ask Pearson. It applies to Louisiana as well. For those of us in the Northeast who are solid Democrats, how would you help us understand the Republican values that Nebraskans loyal to the GOP stand firmly behind?
I think what I would say is that, if you look at or you think about how, think about the Tea Party movement that started in 2010. Think about conservative Catholics and evangelicals. So some of this is ideological, some of it is based in faith, but these are groups of people that tend to be very conservative. And so if you want to understand Republicans in a state like Nebraska, you need to understand those things. You have to understand their views on government, federalism, taxes, and I think you have to understand their views on faith. And I would say those are probably the 2 things. And that's not to say that they represent either the evangelical faith or the Catholic faith perfectly, but because we all know that there's a million different denominations within faith-based organizations. So I would say just keep those 2 things in mind.
And Pearson, same question to you.
Louisianans who are, firmly in the GOP would probably say, and not all of them would say one thing, but there are a number, and I'll do it really quickly. Certainly they are religious. They're more religious than the other side in some cases, although African Americans are quite religious as well. They're going to be focused on guns, on guts, this kind of self-reliance, self-made. There's a very macho element to it that's aligned with America as a macho male country. They're very patriotic. They're very family oriented. Having 7, 8, 9 kids down here is a big deal. People just producing these amazingly large families, which goes along with anti-abortion activism. They're very individualistic. Rights are understood in the sense of what I get to do, not kind of a group rights or so. So they're very anti-taxed, and they really hate government, mostly because it takes their money and does things that they don't like or that they complain about. So those are the values that really motivate Republican voters down here, and you see them over and over and over and over and over again. And they're very effective and very potent. And although you can talk about each one of those and point to some middle ground or some commonality, at the end of the day, Republicans typically do a better job of responding to those values than Democrats do.
Well, thanks, guys. This was really great. It was very informative. And I really appreciate you willing to do it.
Our pleasure, I think.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was fun.